All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know, something I've been thinking about lately is, communication and how some people just seem to, effortlessly connect with anyone.
Yeah, they're like communication ninjas.
Haha, right. Like, what's their secret? Luckily, we've got a stack of sources to help us crack the code on that. We've got interviews with Charles Duhigg. He wrote this book, Supercommunicators, some reviews, and a bunch more videos unpacking his work.
Tons of great stuff. And our mission today, to pull out the gold and give you, dear listeners, some seriously practical tips to, level up your own communication game.
I'm so ready for this. One thing that really resonated with me in Duhigg's book was this example he gives. He's talking about coming home from work, feeling stressed, and wanting to just vent to his wife,
Mm-hmm.
But instead of just listening, she jumps right into problem-solving mode. And it just, totally backfired.
Oh, classic. We've all been there.
Yeah.
It's like the communication equivalent of stepping on a rake.
It really is. And it made me think, why does this happen? Even with the people we're closest to, why do our communication styles clash so often?
Well, Duhigg calls this the 3 conversations in one problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's like most conversations have these 3 different layers happening all at once.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the practical stuff, the emotional stuff, and then the social layer.
So it's we might think we're on the same page, but we're actually tuned into completely different channels.
Exactly.
Okay, so in my example, my intention was to vent and get some emotional support, but my wife heard it as a problem that needed a solution, right?
Yeah, and that's where so much frustration comes from. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You might be saying perfectly reasonable things, but they just don't land right.
So how do we fix this? How do we get on the same wavelength?
Duhigg says the key is to figure out which of those 3 conversations is dominant at that moment, and then match it.
Okay, so it's less about the specific words and more about the intention behind them.
Totally. And get this, when you successfully match the conversation, your brains actually start syncing up.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, it's called neural entrainment. And it creates this feeling of deep connection.
So it's like our brains are having a little communication party.
Uh-huh, exactly. All right, now let's get to some of those super communicator secrets we promised. One of Duhigg's biggies is the power of deep questions.
Ooh, deep questions. Those sound intense. Are we talking super complicated philosophical stuff?
Actually, no. They can be surprisingly simple. It's more about the intent behind the question. Instead of surface-level chit-chat, deep questions invite the other person to share their values, beliefs, experiences, that kind of thing.
So instead of asking, what do, you ask, what's the most rewarding part of your work?
Perfect example. It shows genuine interest in their inner world, not just gathering basic info.
Makes you sound way more interesting than just asking, what's your favorite color?
Exactly. And these questions often start with why, or what did you make of? Prompting deeper thought.
Okay, so it's not about being a master interviewer, it's about being genuinely curious. Now, what about active listening? Everyone says it's important, but what does it actually mean?
It's more than just hearing the words. It's about proving you're listening and understanding. Duhigg has this cool technique called looping for understanding.
Looping? Is that like that game where you whisper something and it gets all messed up by the time it gets back to you?
Haha, not quite. It's a 3-step process. First, ask a question, ideally a deep one. Then, repeat back what you heard in your own words.
So like a verbal check-in?
Exactly. And the 3rd step is crucial. Ask, get that right. It validates them, makes them feel heard.
Sounds so simple, but I can see how powerful that would be. It's like saying, I'm not just pretending to listen, I really want to get you.
All right, now for a secret weapon, that might surprise you. Vulnerability.
Vulnerability. But isn't that the opposite of being a strong communicator?
It might seem counterintuitive, but Duhigg argues that vulnerability is actually the loudest form of communication. It's about letting your guard down, sharing imperfections, being authentic.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that could work. If someone's vulnerable with me, it makes me feel like I can trust them more, right?
Exactly. Creates intimacy and connection way faster than any perfectly crafted argument could.
So are we talking spilling your deepest, darkest secrets to everyone you meet?
No, not necessarily. It's about finding the right level of vulnerability for the situation.
Okay, so how do you know how much to share? Feels like a delicate balance.
Duhigg gives this incredible example of a former CIA officer who successfully recruited a valuable asset by being vulnerable about his own insecurities.
Wait, a CIA officer? I thought those guys were all about being super tough and stoic.
It's a reminder that sometimes the strongest communicators are the ones willing to show their human side. And this leads us perfectly into how these techniques apply in those more challenging conversations.
I was just thinking that, like, how do you use vulnerability when you're in the middle of an argument?
Great question. Duhigg talks about this study where people were asked to have a conversation about race, and they actually had to be bribed to participate.
Wow, seriously. But it kind of makes sense. We're so afraid of saying the wrong thing, especially on sensitive topics.
Right, and that's where these skills become even more important.
So using active listening, vulnerability, those can actually help de-escalate conflict.
Absolutely. He even tells this story about gun control advocates and gun rights advocates, two sides that rarely see eye to eye, successfully communicating using looping.
Wait, they actually had a productive conversation about one of the most divisive issues out there.
Yep. Shows you how these techniques can bridge even the most seemingly impossible divides.
Okay, I'm officially sold on these skills. But let's be real, a lot of our communication these days happens online. And that feels like a whole other beast.
Oh yeah, the digital world definitely throws some curveballs. Yeah. Duhigg points out that it's a relatively new frontier, communication-wise, so we're all still figuring out the rules.
It's like the Wild West of communication. Tons of freedom, but also a lot of room for things to go wrong.
Right, and that's exactly what we'll be tackling in part 2 of this deep dive, how to master the art of digital communication.
Can't wait to unpack those digital communication secrets.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've been geeking out on these super communicator skills, and now it's time to tackle the wild world of digital communication.
Buckle up. It's a bumpy ride.
No kidding. It's like the internet was designed for misunderstandings. Tone gets lost, sarcasm fails, and boom, suddenly you're in an all-out Twitter war.
Happens all the time. But we can't exactly avoid digital communication these days, can we?
Right. It's everywhere. So how do we navigate this digital minefield without, blowing everything up? Do those super communicator skills we talked about even apply here? They do, but we need to adapt them to this new landscape. Duhigg's got some good points on this. He starts by reminding us that internet communication is still pretty young. We're all kind of making up the rules as we go.
Yeah, it's like the Wild West out there. Lots of freedom, but also lots of potential for things to go sideways.
Exactly. And, one of the biggest challenges is that we lose all those nonverbal cues we rely on in person. We can't see someone's face or hear their tone of voice. It's like misinterpretations waiting to happen.
Makes me think of this study Duhigg mentions. They had people communicating only through text, and there were all these hilarious mix-ups because they couldn't tell if the other person was serious or sarcastic.
Oh, yeah. Classic example of how digital communication can just amplify those misunderstandings.
Okay, so what can we actually do about it? What are some practical tips to avoid those digital communication disasters?
Well, Duhigg suggests a few things. First, he says we should assume sincerity, whenever possible.
So give people the benefit of the doubt instead of jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. It's so easy to get caught in that negativity bias online, thinking everyone's out to get us. But starting with the assumption of good intentions can totally shift the tone.
Makes sense. It's like choosing to see the glass half full instead of, dwelling on the negative.
Right. And another important tip is to overemphasize politeness.
So lots of pleases and thank yous, even in casual emails or texts.
Yep. Those little things go a long way in conveying respect and preventing those unnecessary misunderstandings.
It's like adding a little oil to the digital machine, to keep things running smoothly.
One thing Duhigg really cautions against is public criticism, especially on social media.
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one. It's so tempting to call people out online,
I get it. It's almost like a reflex these days. But the thing is, public criticism rarely leads to anything productive. It's more likely to just trigger defensiveness and make things worse.
Plus, once it's out there on the internet, it's out there forever.
Exactly. So even if you disagree with someone, it's almost always more effective to engage them privately, have a real conversation, not a public spectacle.
Solid advice. Okay, but what about when you're actually trying to have a serious conversation online, like giving difficult feedback or talking about something sensitive?
That's where being intentional about the channel you choose becomes crucial. Duhigg talks about how different platforms have different strengths and weaknesses.
So maybe don't try to have a nuanced conversation about politics in a 280-character tweet.
Probably not the best idea.
Yeah.
Text-based platforms are great for quick updates or, logistical stuff, but they're not always ideal for those complex or emotionally charged discussions.
Yeah, you lose all that nuance and emotional context.
Right. If it's something important, pick up the phone or schedule a video call,
At least that way you can hear their tone and see their face, right?
Exactly. Helps bridge that digital gap a bit.
Okay, so switching gears for a minute, Duhigg also talks about the importance of storytelling, even online. Is this just about sharing funny memes?
It's more than memes, although those definitely have their place. The point is, stories help us connect on a deeper level, even in the digital world.
I mean, who doesn't love a good story?
Yeah,
way more engaging than just reading a list of facts.
Right. Stories help us understand things better, remember them better, and feel more connected to the person telling the story.
Okay, but how do you tell a good story online? It's not like we can gather everyone around a digital campfire.
Duhigg reminds us that those same principles of good storytelling still apply online. You need a beginning, a middle, and an end. He has this great mantra, the middle matters.
Interesting. Why the middle?
Because that's where the real action is. It's where the characters face challenges, overcome obstacles, that kind of thing.
That's where the drama unfolds.
Exactly. It's what makes the story memorable.
So when we're crafting our online stories, got to make sure that middle part is super engaging, keeps people hooked.
Right. And we can use all those tools of digital media to make it even better. Images, videos, audio. The possibilities are endless.
It's like taking those traditional storytelling elements and giving them a digital makeover.
Exactly. Now, of course, there will be times when, despite your best efforts, communication just doesn't click.
I hate when that happens. It's like hitting a wall.
Well, in part 3, we're going to dig into those moments when communication feels impossible. We'll talk about the limits of communication and, how to deal with those really tough situations.
I'm ready for that. I'm already feeling more confident about my communication skills, both online and off.
Yeah, that's what we like to hear.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've been unpacking all these amazing super communicator secrets, figuring out how to navigate the digital world, and now, well, it's time to get real. What about those times when communication feels impossible?
Yes, those moments where you feel like you're talking to a brick wall. Super frustrating.
It is. So we've talked about vulnerability being this powerful, loud form of communication, but Duhigg also talks about this other side of the coin, right?
Right. He calls it withholding, which is basically the quietest form of communication, is when we hold back information or emotions. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not even conscious.
So it's like the silent treatment, but maybe not as manipulative.
Exactly. It can be a way to protect ourselves, especially if we feel unsafe or vulnerable.
Like in a, toxic work environment where speaking up will only make things worse.
Yeah, or maybe you're in a relationship where you've learned that expressing certain emotions just leads to arguments.
It's like a self-preservation thing, but it also creates distance and tension.
For sure. And it can be tough to know when withholding is a healthy boundary and when it's actually getting in the way of real communication.
Okay, so how do we figure that out? When to speak up versus when to hold back?
That's where that emotional intelligence comes into play. It's about being able to read the situation, understand the other person's perspective, and adapt accordingly.
Easier said than done, right? I feel like I'm always misreading signals or putting my foot in my mouth.
Well, it definitely takes practice. But Duhigg highlights a few key things to focus on, like paying attention to those nonverbal cues, even online.
So noticing if someone's tone changes in an email, or if they suddenly start using way more emojis than usual.
Exactly. Those little things can give you clues about their emotional state.
It's like learning to read between the digital lines.
Another good one is asking permission before jumping into sensitive topics.
So instead of just launching into a story about, my deepest fear or whatever, I might say, hey, is it cool if I share something personal with you?
Exactly. Shows respect for their boundaries and gives them a sense of control in the conversation.
And what if they say no?
Then you respect that, even if it's disappointing. Remember, trust and connection take time.
Can't rush a good thing, right? Okay, so emotional intelligence, nonverbal cues, asking permission. Anything else? What are some other tools for navigating those really tricky communication situations?
This one might surprise you, but sometimes the best way to break through a communication barrier is to, lean into vulnerability yourself.
Really? Even if the other person is being totally closed off or, hostile, wouldn't that just make things worse?
It's definitely a risk, but it can be powerful. Duhigg talks about how sharing a personal story Admitting your own struggles, sometimes that can disarm the other person, create an opening for connection.
Like you're saying, hey, I'm human too. I make mistakes. I'm not perfect.
Exactly. And that can foster empathy where there wasn't any before.
It's like turning that whole vulnerability equals weakness thing on its head.
Right. And remember, it doesn't have to be some huge dramatic reveal. Sometimes just acknowledging your own discomfort can be enough.
Feel like saying, hey, this is kind of awkward, but I really want to understand where you're coming from.
Perfect. Shows honesty, openness, and it can encourage the other person to, meet you halfway.
Yeah, lower their guard a little bit.
Now, of course, there are going to be times when no matter what you do, communication just doesn't work.
Ugh, the dreaded dead end.
And in those moments, it's important to remember that you can't control how other people behave or force them to communicate the way you want them to.
So what do you do then?
Sometimes the best thing you can do is, walk away. At least for a bit. Give yourself and the other person space to cool down.
Hit the pause button on the conversation.
Exactly. And when you come back to it, try to approach it with a fresh perspective, a willingness to listen.
Okay, so even when it feels impossible, there are still things we can try.
Absolutely. And remember, even those super communicators we've been talking about, they have those moments where they feel like they're failing. It's all part of the process.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about, becoming a better communicator, both online and off.
Me too. Lots of great takeaways from Duhigg's work.
So, to everyone listening, remember, communication is a skill. We can learn it, we can practice it. It's not always easy, but it's definitely worth it.
Get out there and communicate with courage, authenticity, and a genuine desire to connect.
Happy communicating, everyone.